Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Myles, on another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. If you are new to the channel, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Please hit like and subscribe. Also, if you are a returning visitor, glad to have you back. We're just going to get right into it today. This is a pre-recorded episode, so sadly, I can't respond to any of your positive or negative comments or questions, but definitely leave them in the comments because I, for the most part, respond to them there. The Poverty of Anti-Wokeness is the title of our guest article today. It seems like a lifetime ago when America welcomed its first Black president. The United States was beginning the, quote, post-racial era. With Barack Obama in the White House, the fervor of a heterogeneous group of young voters that helped get him elected to the United States was making a massive leap forward in getting beyond its racial past. Was that really the case, though? It was during Obama's second term in office that Black Lives Matter was birthed out of the tragic vigilante murder of Trayvon Martin. A few years later, Eric Gardner and Michael Brown would meet similar fates, but this time at the hands of law enforcement. This is the beginning of what our guest today notes as the first racial reckoning. The most popular dissenting voice in mainstream liberal media during this time is Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates wrote glowingly of Barack Obama's 2 terms in office with his "We Were 8 Years in Power," followed up by his Case for Reparations essay and the book that won him the MacArthur Genius Grant, Between the World and Me. Coates writes a narrative about the immutable force of white supremacy. White supremacy is infinite, and Black America's struggle against this powerful foe is an eternal struggle with no victory in sight. Sorry about that. Recently, Coates commented that all policies in the world don't matter as long as the hearts and minds of white people in power don't recognize the humanity of their minority subjects. What was in Obama's heart during his deportation and drone bombing campaigns? Coates and later Ibrahim X. Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, wrote books and gave talks for a fee on the perseverance of the original sin that is baked into the soul of the United States of America, racism, and gave rise to the commercialization of the idea of wokeness from our guest's piece in Compact Magazine. Before it was anything else, quote, wokeness was a pessimistic counter narrative to Obama era post racialism. It sought to establish the violent subjugation of Black people as the central truth of America's past and present, and to reorient policymaking accordingly. As Coates puts it in one of the most quoted lines in From Between the World and Me, in America, it is traditional to destroy the Black body. It is heritage for whites. Getting woke meant becoming attuned to the omnipresence and I can't say the word, of racial oppression of a policy level. It meant any approach that didn't put race front and center was at best inadequate and at worst pernicious. That is from our guest today, Geoff Shullenberger, a managing editor at Compact Magazine. Wherever you are listening or watching the show, there are links in the description to Geoff's piece and his social media profile. Please welcome Geoff Shullenberger. It's intrascience. I was practicing saying it before the show, and I totally blanked as we started. Thanks for joining us today, Geoff. How are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
In your piece, you start off by talking about a moment Ta-Nehisi Coates has with Barack Obama, where he calls him out for the racial disparities in the universal coverage in his Obamacare health plan. Tell us about that moment and why you wanted to start your piece there.
So it was partly just thinking about a sort of decade-long cycle of politics, of culture war politics, and the rise of this kind of new or revived sort of racial consciousness that we saw emerge as you were describing in the intro around the first upswellings of Black Lives Matter protests as well as
Mhm.
kind of social media posting. And so, this incident where Coates confronts Obama at the White House, and at that point, he's there with a number of other liberal journalists, but he's relatively lonely in his kind of critical stance towards Obama, right? Who's just won his second term and is considered, to be quite, I mean, sort of has the not quite the glow he had around 2008, but he's regained some of it by you know winning an impressive hard-fought election in 2012. And so Coates is sort of a detractor at this point. As you said, his later book that comes out after the Obama term is somewhat
Mhm.
more celebratory, but at this point he's kind
Mhm.
of on his blog and in this encounter he's more critical. And what he points out, and that what I think is striking here is that kind of looking at the Affordable Care Act and the debates around it from the left at the time when all that was unfolding, the usual criticism was, it's kind of this piecemeal reform, which is ultimately derived from kind of conservative think tanks, and
Yeah.
it really just kind of it sort of reforms this quite broken and unjust system like around the edges, but it doesn't really address its fundamental injustice. And most notable on the left was criticizing Obama for having not pushed through a public option, right?
Mhm.
Much less the sort of actual universal coverage of the sort we have in other parts of the world.
Mhm.
Whereas Coates' critique is different, right? What he's saying is, the things you should be concerned about are the specific racial disparities in healthcare access. And so the problem with the Affordable Care Act is that it didn't address these disparities. So this foresees a line of criticism that you later see popularized by the aforementioned Ibram Kendi, right?
Mhm.
Which is that the goal of any policy should be to reduce disparities between racial groups, and that the sort of pursuit of social justice should focus primarily on this kind of racial disparity frame. And so it struck me that around 10 years ago we have Coates in the
Mhm.
center of American power sort of confronting the president with this argument, that at the time you didn't hear as much, but then it
Mhm.
becomes more and more more and more commonly voiced, and widely accepted in the years after that. So it seemed like an interesting inflection point, that really what was and it was before Coates's book came out. It was before he released his essay on reparations,
Yeah.
which similarly I think helped, or was quite crucial. That essay on reparations, which was a very impressive piece of writing and reporting. It was quite an epic, almost kind of short book length piece of reporting that I think really did shift the national conversation, at least among sort of the liberal intelligentsia in that direction. So this seemed like the first glimmer of something that would become increasingly powerful as an argument, and compelling to many as an argument in the years after that.
I think Coates takes a lot of the case for reparations from Richard Rothstein's book, if I'm not mistaken, Color of Law.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think that book definitely changed his stance because at one point in time he was not very, very pro reparations, and then he reads
That's
that
right.
book.
Yeah.
Coates is an interesting character, and I'm kind of glad you centered your piece around him specifically because he uses this moment to rise to a level of importance for a guy that leaves all this political writing and goes to write Black Panther and stuff
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
that. That's kind of where he wants to be anyway. If you really get to know the history of Ta-Nehisi Coates, and that case for reparations, and it almost feels like it derails certain movements. I mean, in my piece, I read your piece not long after mine got published in Damage magazine, and I talk a little bit more about the Bernie Sanders and the moment that he had dealing with Black Lives Matter during his first election, and how even in 2020, what is your Black agenda? And Ta-Nehisi Coates to me really puts that front and center in the post-Obama years, which is when I say post-Obama years, I mean post-Obama in the White House. I don't mean post-Obama in the cultural realm, because Obama is everywhere. He is. You cannot escape the Obamas.
Yeah. Well, I suppose it's kind of interesting that Coates and Obama, both of them kind of before their rise to prominence, they initially write, both of them write a kind of literary memoir, right? Obama's Dreams from My Father, which comes out before he's really, and he writes, when he has more literary ambitions, I think it's before he really necessarily yet sees himself as a political figure, although that was always part of what he was imagining. But that book is kind of, it's not manicured. It's kind of candid in some ways, that make it not like his later campaign book, let's say. And Coates, similarly, his previous book before Between the World and Me is The Beautiful Struggle, which again, I think he writes before he's kind of developed the worldview we maybe associate him with, and it's more of a kind of it's a work of literary memoir. So both of them are kind of they both have this kind of literary bent, but in different ways become very significant in kind of setting and resetting the political agenda. But both of them are in some ways figures in the sort of Black American literary tradition, we might say, and they're kind of drawing on the sort of riches of that tradition. And that's why, to me, Coates seems like the most kind of interesting and sort of lasting figure of this moment, just because he does have the kind of he has a literary talent then that someone like Kendi that does not really, and I think as you said, it is kind of interesting that he as the issues he really brings front and center sort of become in some sense he himself kind of retreats back into these more literary pursuits. Of course, he writes his first novel a couple of years ago. And so, I think he's probably the most interesting figure to come out of this whole kind of literary phenomenon of the 2010s that I begin by describing.
It feels like he wants to be James Baldwin. I've never really felt that he was Baldwin. It's me personally. But that's what it feels like he's definitely drawing on. Even Between the World and Me is his fire next time. The first racial reckoning, as you call it, happens at the tail end of the Obama presidency. How does this, in your opinion, lead to the election of Donald Trump? How do we go from post-racial to racist president in just 4 years?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question. So I think we clearly in the I'd say the really simple explanation that I hope you might be sympathetic to, which is given what my understanding and familiarity with your work, is that underlying all of these tendencies is a set of kind of material shifts in American life, right? And so I think in some sense these are both both the sort of racial reckoning, which is one expression of disillusionment with the sort of Obama era order that, let's not forget, comes into being just as the financial crisis devastates the world economy. Obama, of course, comes in as somebody who's seen as a transformational figure, who's supposedly promising a kind of new socioeconomic order that will be more just and fair. And of course, instead what we get is really, as everyone knows, that no consequences for those who brought about the financial crisis. And really quite a disastrous situation for middle class and working class people in America, because there are so many underwater mortgages brought about by this kind of insane speculative frenzy that preceded the crisis. And for the most part, these people are not helped out. They're not rescued at all. And this has a particularly devastating effect on, as has been written about extensively, on Black wealth, right? And it's in terms that someone like Kendi or Coates would prefer. There's a great deal of disparity in that effect. There's a disproportionality that Black Americans face worse consequences overall, on average, from the fallout of this catastrophic collapse of home prices, and people being left with underwater mortgages that they can't pay off. That is clearly a real phenomenon that can be very well documented. In my piece, I cite the People's Policy Project, which is Matt Brunig's sort of crowdfunded think tank, essentially, where he documents this in detail, and also shows that this was really the consequence of choices that Obama made, right? It wasn't just a situation he inherited. But okay, that's just one example of how the fallout from the financial crisis is extremely severe for all sorts of people in all sorts of ways. It's never really resolved, right? The recovery is largely helpful at kind of continuing to concentrate wealth in the hands of the wealthiest, and generally creates a kind of dismal situation for much of the country, right? And things are sort of kept afloat, and lots of stimulus money is injected into the economy to kind of prevent a further collapse. But it's clear that things aren't so great, and so that's in a simple sense why I think you do have in the intervening years, you have the Occupy movement, which I won't get bogged down in talking about, which sort of attempts to articulate a direct response to this. But that once that sort of trails off for various reasons and doesn't quite gain political traction, two things happen, right? One is that I think left kind of organizing energies get channeled into the initial phase of the Black Lives Matter movement, and this kind of increasing concern with police violence, and these kind of spectacular viral killings of Black people. And then on the other hand, you have the kind of initial phase of kind of electoral left populism and the sort of Bernie Sanders campaign. As you mentioned before, these two things kind of come into conflict at a certain point, right, where Bernie is confronted for not sort of having a Black agenda, as you said. So what I'd say is that you have all of these things that are ultimately symptoms of just the complete disaster of 2008, and the longer, more drawn out disaster of Obama's response, of the Obama administration's response to it. And the fallout of all of that is not all felt at once, right? It takes time. And so I think the simplest way to think about this, and that I propose in the piece, is that really there is an overall sense of kind of diminishing expectations, right? Which is ironic that this era starts out with Obama's kind of soaring rhetoric and this idea of kind of recapturing some kind of vision of American progress. The overall reality of this period is average people of all sorts feeling that the sort of the promise of America that they may have been led to believe in at some point was simply not being fulfilled. And so the way to respond to that, because in part attempts to kind of respond directly to the economic situation, were made, but for various reasons didn't take off politically. And so instead, I think you had a certain kind of retrenchment um, into identity groups, right, as a way of kind of trying to confront the situation, right? And the question basically we might say is, how do people organize themselves in order to extract or make some kind of demands to power and extract some kind of concessions. So that's in a sense how we might think about all of these different kind of oppositional or anti-establishment political developments. And those I think that's a kind of broad enough frame to understand developments both on the left and on the right, that you have these kind of these different expressions of disillusionment with the party establishments. And
Definitely.
ultimately what they amount to is kind of attempts to constitute groups that can collectively make some demand on power. Now, often those demands, I think, are quite, are in a sense kind of shockingly limited and unambitious in terms of what they are. That which I would say, is, and I wrote about this a few years ago, is I think a kind of internalization of the logic of austerity, right? That in some sense, people are attempting to make demands of power, but in fact, the demands they're making are actually not particularly demanding, right? They're actually demanding quite limited and minimal things. And I would say that's a kind of reflection of the way that people have kind of been trained to limit their demands and expectations, by overall conditions of austerity.
It's interesting that you bring that up, because when I think about that moment, especially 2008, as it takes a while for the rubble to finally finish falling when it comes to the financial crisis, the crash, and the loss of homes. As you probably know, it wasn't instantaneous, right? It wasn't like a foreclosure happened for a lot of people and then they were out the next day. Some people stayed in houses for a year or two, sometimes even 5 years. It's all kind of, the Home Records is a pretty good book. I can't remember the author's name. Came out 4 or 5 years ago. That really detailed a few people's stories, especially with reverse mortgages and things like that, that really just ripped through elderly communities, especially elderly communities of color. And so it took a while kind of for people to feel that. But when they did, we get things like a growing elderly itinerant workforce at Amazon that becomes a book that turns into a movie that almost glorifies homelessness and van living for upper middle class and above. Young people become a trendy hashtag and part-time lifestyle commitment. But for elderly people in this country, it becomes literal survival. And I find it interesting that when we talk about that moment, we don't talk too much about the houselessness that happens, because the problem then becomes just racism, which it's kind of an abstraction, right? Like, okay, well, it's white people in law enforcement that's the problem. It's not that Meemaw and Pawpaw are living in an RV. It's that you might face some sort of violent end at the hands of law enforcement for a very banal traffic stop. And that's what always had me scratching my head about the whole thing, because I'm like, well, I just lost everything. I lost a business, I lost homes, I lost my cars, like I lost everything. And it wasn't the cops that took it. It was the sheriff that put a lock on the door, but ultimately, we're not talking about that. And it almost felt like the people that were complaining the most, and other people have talked to Adolph Reed, definitely talks about this, seem to be coming from a middle class place and this becomes their cause. I guess that leads into my third question or talking point. These are more talking points than questions, right? Wokeness seems to be a PMC ideology that doesn't really have much effect on the lives of poor and working class Black Americans. How does this kind of niche project gain such impressionable ground in the current discourse?
So, I think, and I'll sort of, try to make this partly anecdote. I think in the piece, I try to make it, a kind of broader, maybe sociological analysis. But this is partly derived from anecdote and from the environments that I exist in. And I think there are a few things here. One is that that there was a kind of going back to, say, the 90s, that there was kind of let's just take one example. I remember being very young when the Malcolm X movie came out.
Spike Lee's Malcolm X.
And so, there's kind of this, and I remember seeing Do the Right Thing when I was very, which really, it dramatizes the same sort of situation that galvanizes the BLM protests, really. So there is, I think, alongside the kind of Gen X and maybe older millennial cohort, who are kind of coming into positions in the media, such that they're able to set the terms of the discourse. Like, there is a kind of undercurrent of these more pessimistic accounts of race in America, that go back a long way, right? That's always, there's always been some level of exposure, right, to that, and there's a kind of familiarity of it that I think means that it's maybe not that difficult to activate, because there's already some some kind of knowledge of it and familiarity with the basic frameworks of it that are that make up some portion of the kind of culture that thinking basically middle class, sort of educated white people absorbed during those kind of years of the 80s and 90s, which, particularly the 90s are now remembered as this time when supposedly we were sort of, and now people kind of look back critically on this, right? But supposedly this time when sort of race was being overcome and so on. But that wasn't the whole picture, right? There was this kind of counter discourse already present then. But I would say just the thing that anecdotally strikes me is if you think about what happened in 2008, and again the kind of glow around the Obama project, which was really quite vacuous in a lot of ways, right? It was not it was not a particularly robust vision, but people were really looking for, and you could see this all around. Like, people were looking for this kind of figure and this kind of project to attach themselves to, just in order to have some kind of sense of kind of shared moral purpose. And so I think people were really, and again, and as I talk about in the piece, that there was this kind of broader, question of, like, what is America sort of after the Cold War moment is over? What is America coming into the new millennium? You get on the right this very influential answer to that, right, which is basically the kind of Project for a New American Century, this kind of robust, like, unipolar, full spectrum dominance of the world, which is attached to this kind of messianic project of spreading democracy. So that whole thing, is kind of falling apart. And in the absence, so there's, I think, and this speaks to kind of what the significance of the sort of second Bush term and the Abu Ghraib and these other kind of atrocities that are coming to light in this period, that it creates this vacuum where there's a great disillusionment, which I think is then reinforced in a different way by the financial crisis. And so people are just really looking for some kind of project to attach themselves that will give some kind of shared purpose and vision to their sense of what they're doing. And so anecdotally, I can just say, like, I observed this all around. It was very hard to be, particularly in a kind of university setting, the sort of groupthink around like Obama, being a sort of
man, and if you said
Obama
anything
devotee
negative,
was extremely strong, right? And so I think that groupthink, and then sort of, let's say, 6 to 8 years later, kind of the groupthink coalescing around the kind of, a vision that was in some ways a kind of inversion of that, right? Which is this kind of, quite pessimistic vision about race and America. That I mean, the groupthink around it became similarly intense, right? It became very hazardous to kind of dissent from it, and so I think in the kind of educated milieu of like whatever elites and sort of minor elites in the making, I would certainly say that those two moments kind of mirrored each other in a sort of inverted way, right? That both of them represented this kind of sense of, okay, like, what is America? What is our purpose in the world? And what kind of shared purpose do we have that we can kind of commit to and give ourselves some kind of sense of meaning? And so both were responses to that, both really kind of, and I think a few people have pointed this out as well, that it's interesting that, like, in the post sort of 1965 era with mass immigration from Asia and Latin America, you have this kind of, as well as the rise of a great deal of kind of interracial marriage, mixed race families, and so on. You have a complicating of the kind of racial makeup of the country, right? Which is, of course, part of what inspires this idea that we're going to enter this post-racial era. But what these what this new narrative does is in a sense retreats back into this kind of relatively simple ground where you can have a kind of clear binary and kind of orient yourself and your sense of the kind of morality of politics around that binary, which is presented in things like Kendi's work in the 1619 Project and elsewhere as just this kind of foundational and inescapable fact of America, right? And so it provides you with this kind of orientation in this otherwise kind of bewildering world where all of these kind of attempts to create new shared narratives seem to be failing. And so, I think that's, and again, this is, I guess maybe I ended up being more sociological than I intended to here, but certainly it's something I could kind of feel and observe all around me, during those years. And I'm talking about sort of being around like educated white people. This was, they were looking for these kind of stories, and they were, easily brought into this condition where they were extremely protective of them and kind of caught up in this type of groupthink.
It's interesting that you say that, because I remember 2004. I remember the huge we've been talking about this on the show quite a lot. The big anti-war protest of 2003. That's this massively large protest, but Bush gets reelected. No war is stopped or really even discussed. When we think about the anti-war movement, I think if you ask the average young person about the anti-war movement, they would probably mention flowers and guns in the 60s and the iconography of hippies. No one really thinks about Gen Xers marching, because I think we see that moment as a loss, and we see the hippies as some sort of victory. Also, I want to harken back to your Spike Lee comment, which I appreciate you mentioning Spike Lee. I've done my fair share of work on this show. The last video essay I did was called "Same as It Ever Was," and it's about kind kind of the continuity of Black exploitation in film, and how it doesn't look to me much different in the modern era than it did in the quote unquote Black exploitation era when it comes to stereotypical images. Wakanda is a monarchy and a technologically advanced empire where people still ride animals and have spears. And it's through the lens of it's two old white guys, Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, create Wakanda. It wasn't like Huey Newton sitting there and Bobby Seale were the advisors on that.
Wakanda is almost neo-reactionary. It's this kind of this high-tech monarchical sort of highly isolated state. It's like these guys who are fascinated with Singapore or something.
It's what's funny, and who's behind Disney that's greenlighting this stuff. It's funny when I did the end of that video essay, I show a thing that I think Jimmy Kimmel had done, where he had, is it Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Fallon, one of the Jimmys, did a thing where they had the late what is the young man's name that passed away that played
Chadwick Boseman.
Chadwick Boseman
Yeah.
is hiding behind a mirror, and people are there talking about how much they like the movie. And then Chadwick Boseman will come out and people are like, yeah, I told my son that the two greatest Black people in the world are you and Barack Obama. I'm like, fuck, I weep for your son. That's his reality of fucking greatness. But Spike Lee, to me, has a very interesting origin story, because he becomes kind of the face of Black film that, in my opinion, his mission is kind of to destroy this super Negro caricature that really gains a lot of popularity in the 70s through what we call Black exploitation films. And I think Spike Lee feels that he's not getting enough stories of his class of Black person. Spike Lee also comes up around the same time as we get Bill Cosby, which also for a time destroys these ideas of what the Black family looks like or can look like, right? Before Cosby, it's Good Times and the Jeffersons.
Yeah.
And this, it's a very different depiction of Black family life with these two filmmakers. And Spike Lee's She's Gotta Have It is premiered in front of a predominantly white audience in San Francisco. And it is only when those people give it a standing ovation that the movie studios go, okay, well, let's back this guy. So it's like, you kind of have to ask the question, well, who are these movies ever for anyway?
Yeah.
And what kind of life is it depicting? And there's a flattening of Blackness, I think, in a lot of the people that we're discussing today, that all of us face the same problems no matter what. It's the Henry Louis Gates got pulled over by the cops, so of course racism is forever the rock that Sisyphus is pushing uphill. And I'm like, well, Henry Louis Gates's interaction with law enforcement is going to be much different than mine. I'm not going to be able to say, I'm going to call my friend the president, literally the freaking president, and we'll get this rectified. If I got the expired tag, I get pulled over, it's not going to be good for me.
Now, that was another interesting episode in the Obama era, right? That he, Gates is brought into the White House, and I think they have this, it's like a beer summit, right? With the white cop. It's very odd. Another interesting thing about Gates, which and not to get too sidetracked, but if you look into Gates's archive, he really in the 80s and 90s he wrote several pieces, really attempting to kind of dismantle critical race theory. And he's, I mean, it's interesting just in terms of the way that, which, and again, part of my point in the piece is that a lot of these ideas, they're kind of sitting around, and they have a sort of, relatively limited kind of institutional reach. Critical race theory being one of them that's sort of been around since the 70s, 80s.
In
But
law
at
school.
that point, right, yeah. But at that
In
point,
law school.
Gates comes in, and he's really, he's at that point the kind of rising star of African American studies as a discipline, and he writes a couple of extremely devastating attacks on critical race theory. And it does seem, and these are four kind of middle brow, mainstream magazines. I can't remember exactly which ones, but it does seem like within the court of kind of sort of mainstream elite liberal opinion, Gates very much wins the day against critical race theory at that point, in the sort of early 90s. And so it's interesting that I mean, this figure has been around for a long time, but at that point, he was clearly positioning himself in a certain way, against figures like Derek Bell, who I think we could clearly say, and contrary to what sort of a lot of right-wing narratives would claim, that a discipline like African American studies at that point, in leading figures like Gates, was actually kind of strongly trying to differentiate itself from the work of people like Derek Bell. And these splits were significant because there was a kind of respectability that figures like Gates achieved, and kind of, again, sort of mainstream middle. And of course, now he has a TV show. I mean, that's a little bit story, but
you own slaves.
Right, exactly. But so the idea that it's actually not even really the case that critical race theory, it was still a relatively marginal and kind of marginalized thing in academia, and was kind of put down and was sort of had to be kind of disavowed by somebody like Gates, or didn't have to be, but was disavowed by somebody like Gates, because that they were trying to, people like him at the time were trying to carve out a different kind of political space within academia and within kind of the world of like the Atlantic readership. And that's all other thing that came up in this piece, by the way, which is like the significance of the Atlantic magazine and kind of setting the tone of and the terms of the discussion. Because of course Coates is there, and Kendi is there as well. But I think that would be different from the Atlantic in like the 90s or 2000s, where the kind of Gates position against critical race theory would be quite a bit stronger and have quite a bit more of a following.
Can we just admit that Henry Louis Gates is the Maury Povich of intellectuals? Bernie Sanders, you are the slave owner. Oh, but did they have health care? That's the show that we really need, right? That's the show that America needs. I know I don't have you for much longer, and there's a couple things I definitely want to get your opinion on. Speaking of the Atlantic, I was actually having a conversation, which is where this question comes from, with a friend of mine who published a very interesting piece in the Atlantic after the decision to end affirmative action. Bertrand Cooper. So has wokeness and anti-wokeness discourse obfuscated the fact that liberals are the victors in the culture war, yet conservatives have won politically? This is something that I don't think we talk about when we talk about culture wars. We act as if there is some sort of battle. I don't know if there really is one, because culturally, wokeness is championed. again, Wakanda can't be made, Black Panther can't be made, if not for wokeness. And I'm saying that as a comic book fan. You know, there's some marginal characters in comics. You know, some of it has to do with, you know, licensing rights, but let's just be honest here. But politically, we've seen Roe v. Wade. We've seen kids in cages. You know, there hasn't been much for housing security. Nothing's happening on the healthcare front positive. Politically, it feels like the right's in charge. Look at the courts, from the Supreme on down to the federal courts. Look at state legislatures becoming little fiefdoms, if you will. But the culture war, you know, the Obamas are running a victory lap right now with their Netflix deal. There's a stamp from the beginning movie coming out, which is really interesting considering what happened to Ibrahim X. Kendi. It's not like he's losing donor dollars. It's not like people still aren't calling on Ta-Nehisi Coates to be the voice of whatever. You know, the guy that said that, you know, the way Israel and Palestine did reparations sure seems like it works fine. You know, now he's singing quite a different tune. But again, culturally, wokeness is champion, for better or for worse. You know, I kind of don't care what kind of Superman, if he's non-binary, but you know, these cultural markers are all over the place of wokeness's victory lap. Recently, I saw Disney has a new director for some new Star Wars stuff that is a woman that said it's time for us to have some female-centered stories in the Star Wars universe, which I thought was interesting because I was like, didn't you watch the last 3 movies? Silly me. But politically, there's nothing. You know, we talk about this on the show where we often say Black Power succeeded culturally, where it failed politically. It feels that wokeness is the same thing. What is your opinion on that, Geoff?
Yeah. So, you know, you bring up the courts. I mean, it's worth noting that, you know, the right likes to talk about this sort of long march to the institutions, that you know, these kind of left-wing figures go into academia. You know, my own take on this, which some people on the right actually agree with, is that, I mean, that was mostly to the detriment of the left rather than to its benefit. You know, because
I agree with you. I'm in total agreement with you on that, brother.
It created a very different set of incentives, and you know, that basically left-wing sort of theory ideas became a kind of currency of professional advancement within academia. So, you know, that's, and anybody who's sort of spent time around sort of academic Marxists, you know, whatever, some of them are my best friends, so no offense to them, but they do they do tend to
Black
but they,
Marxists.
you know, they do tend to academic Marxists, you know, they function by all appearances the same way that academic you know, whatever Milton Friedmanites would, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's significant. But you know, so you know, there's a question of like which institutions. So, you know, you could say the right with you know, things like the Federalist Society undertook a kind of systematic project of you know, getting judges appointed, you know, ensuring a kind of consistency around various positions, and so that's borne fruit in one way. You know, the left's you know, or you know, particularly the kind of cultural left, or whatever we want to call it, you know, its capture of various kind of institutions has enabled certain things to happen. But you know, I think it's quite shocking how I mean, you bring up like whatever, state houses, small, just like it seems clear to me that, say, something like the pro-life movement, and I wrote something about this last year, is not particularly good at sort of winning in the court of public opinion, right? It hasn't necessarily moved the needle on making more people agree with it, maybe a little bit, but overall not really. But and in fact, it's been losing, in some decisive ways in the political field. But nonetheless, it did figure out how to organize in such a way that it could make remarkable progress at achieving its aims, without necessarily needing to sort of have a great deal of public opinion behind it. So, I think there are sort of questions about how different political formations organize what institutions they emphasize. And I don't know. I mean, there's probably a lot to get into as to why, certain groups went in certain directions. But going back to your initial question, I think part of the way I would see it is that ultimately these things are quite symbiotic, right? That they, there are ways that the cultural sort of hegemony of a certain form of liberalism is actually quite optimal for certain economic aims that are generally associated with the right, and vice versa, right? That the two things are not really entirely separable, right? That there's kind of a way that disseminating a certain vision of liberalism as the kind of cultural, the kind of shared cultural agenda of at least the educated class, which ramifies, as you said, in popular culture, in elite institutions, like that this is not that this is actually quite helpful to certain sort of economic projects, right? That these are arrangements that have kind of developed in a kind of symbiotic relationship over the decades.
And the final question I have is again, as I know time is of the essence for you today. In your piece, you quote Freddie DeBoer, where he says, "Show me a movement, and I'll show you someone willing to profit off it." That to me makes these movements seem inherently sinister. Can't there be true believers who feel that because of the genuine belief in their cause, they should be able to profit off of it? Can we kind of broaden that to say that, as Mark Fisher wrote about so presciently in Capitalist Realism, that maybe we need to say neoliberal realism, that we can have honest beliefs, genuine beliefs of what a fair and just society should look like, and there's nothing wrong with making a few bucks off it, because the nonprofit complex, I'm not going to call them this, but the nonprofits in general aren't really necessarily left projects.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that, and I was sort of trying to hint at that with my remarks about what I felt and experienced as far as the kind of shifts in opinion, in my sort of social milieu, in the past sort of 15 years, that people were, I mean, not only did people really genuinely believe these things, but they really were drawn to them because they offered something to believe in. And so I firmly think that's true of a lot of these. I mean, I think it's even true of, if you think of the scandal around the Black Lives Matter founders, sort of sketchy properties, and sort of, I mean, I'm pretty sure that, I don't want to claim I can mind read anybody, but I'm pretty sure that the people who extracted those benefits, believed that what they were doing was just and in the name of a just cause, and that they actually deserved that because of the value of the work they were doing. And so so I would slightly disagree with Freddie there, or at least with the way that he frames it, that I think actually it's the true belief that can make the, what in some cases, and I mean in some cases are just kind of minor, careerism and so on, but and sort of opportunism, but in other cases are actually like pretty spectacular corruption, as in this case, can really be driven by this sense of justice, right? That if you're really in a sense like one of the elect, right, who's really been kind of chosen in some sense to do the work of
Mhm.
remedying these great social problems, then yeah, that probably creates a sense that what you're doing is deserving of those kind of rewards. So yeah, I wouldn't see those, I wouldn't see it as requiring cynicism. Obviously, there are some figures who might be, I don't know, I'd be interested to know like what, say like Sean King is really, really in his heart of hearts, but so there's some who seem, whose kind of grift seems blatant enough that it's harder to tell. But I'd say with a lot of these figures, it really is something where there are things that can kind of be objectively cynical without being subjectively cynical, if that makes sense. That that there's almost like
Yes.
that if you look at the function that this ideology is serving, then there's a kind of irony in the situation that implies a kind of objectively cynical character, but that the people themselves, I don't think, for the most part, experience it as a kind of cynical grift. On the contrary.
That's where I again push back on stuff like that. I did read, I think 40% of DeBoer's last book, and that's I think to assume or to frame it in a certain way where they're just not good people kind of opens up the more rank and file population, that may not be devouring all this left content into this idea that everybody is a scammer, and it is people like Donald Trump that tell the truth, even in their despicable nature. Um, he's honest in his criminality, so that to me it gives rise to the idea of an anti-hero, an honest,
Yeah,
a bad guy with a good heart. And that seems to be what you get from that idea. And I think we have to be a little more honest in our critiques. I think Cedric Johnson has some very, very sincere critiques of Black Lives Matter in his last book. Um, and the dismissiveness, I think, in people's honesty, because it goes back to me what you said about Spike Lee, that John Singleton, all those movies that come out in the 90s, there is some honesty in that, where people are living precarious lives, your reliance on law enforcement really isn't there. Either you need them, and sometimes you're scared if they show up. I'm 46, so I remember growing up in Northern California in the 90s extremely vividly. So as much as I don't like a lot of the things that come out of Black Lives Matter, I can't be so dismissive that all they wanted to do was get hundreds of millions of dollars, and they knew that was going to happen all along. That's kind of foolish and arrogant.
yeah, and I mean another thing I argue in the piece that I think a lot of the kind of anti-woke discourse
Mhm.
doesn't fully articulate is, yeah, there is on one hand a kind of rationality to the project, right? That it's
Mhm.
I think particularly a lot of the coverage you get from the right, but also the kind of intellectual dark web sort of center is like, I don't know, this stuff is just like irrational. It's just this kind of it's like people lack critical thinking. They've just been like deluded by these ideas. No, I mean, I think there is a kind of rationality to it, almost kind of operationally, right? That it does have to do with as I put it at the beginning, kind of organizing on some collective level to be able to make some kind of demands and extract some kind of concessions. And so
Mhm.
it does work. I don't think it works, um, I don't think it works very broadly, right? I think it works for certain subsets of people in certain contexts. And in some sense, the fact of it is a kind of indictment of the absence of kind of broader collective political projects, right? That have been sort of demobilized and crushed in various ways. And so, but yeah, but I think that that fact doesn't mean that people don't don't believe in the. I think people do believe in the validity of these kind of forms of collective organizing, even if the actual sort of payoffs of them are perhaps less sort of lofty than their rhetoric might frame them to be. Nevertheless, there is a they are, yeah, I think they are driven by a genuine belief and sense of justice, and and again, perhaps part of the problem here is the withdrawal from certain maybe more kind of capacious projects of justice or of kind of collective organization, right? Which might be in some sense asking for more. I mean, just going back to BLM, I think something that's quite notable about it is just if it's framed as kind of this demand to like stop killing us or stop killing people, it's a just demand, right? It's a reasonable thing to demand. It's also quite a limited thing to demand, right? Because ultimately, you can be alive and also be in quite a bad way, right? And so, to go to some examples of this that have come up recently, I mean, I think the situation of George Floyd is notable here, right?
Ooh, okay.
Like the fact of his having been killed is one element of the kind of tragedy of his existence, but there were many things about him that were there are many problems he faced that would not have been solved by his not being killed, if that makes sense. In other words, his that demand doesn't offer very much in terms of like what is the broader vision for the sort of positive goods that someone in his position might be able to obtain that were they to live longer. And I think an even more kind of striking instance of this was the killing of this man, Jordan Neely, here in New York, in the subway, which, there was a long piece kind of looking into his life and background in New York Magazine a couple of weeks ago. And, what was interesting there was that, both his best friend and like a clinician who had worked with him when he was in Rikers, in the kind of psychiatric facility within Rikers, and a few other people sort of said like, look, he was in a state where, because of his severe mental health issues and addictions, he was in a state where, essentially being left loose as he was, something terrible was going to happen to him, right? And everybody knew that. Yet there was kind of this inability to do anything about it. So I think that's kind of another example of like where the protests that set off briefly, were really about like he shouldn't have been killed. But, what about like the way he was living before that? I mean, again, I'm just struck by the kind of, and this isn't just a matter of his not having had access to housing or things like that. It's partly also a matter of like how a society deals with people in the kind of state that he was in, right? Which is a difficult question and raises all kinds of ethical issues in terms of, whether we can essentially forcibly confine people who are, considered a danger to themselves and others. But I guess, again, what strikes me here is that there's a kind of limitedness to this vision, right? That it's saying, okay, he shouldn't have died, but like, what is it saying positively about his life? I mean, and it's, and another thing to add, I mean, you brought up NGOs. It's also notable that, I mean, NGOs are part of sort of broader, and this kind of goes back to like the left winning or liberalism in a certain version winning in some contexts and the right winning in others, right? I mean, there's a kind of neoliberal privatization, let's say. It takes multiple forms. One of them is the expansion of the NGO complex, right, and the kind of outsourcing of various kinds of societal state functions onto these NGOs, right, which have all sorts of incentives that are often quite perverse, right, because they have people who have jobs that depend on a problem continuing to exist. And so, in some sense, it's not really in their interest to conclusively solve certain problems, just in a kind of sense of rational self-interest. And so what you have are all these kind of this complex of NGOs with people who are in a situation like Jordan Neely's, who don't really have an incentive to provide any kind of broader solution, because in a sense what they're being funded by this kind of outsourcing of taxpayer dollars to do is to kind of manage the ongoing crisis, right? But not to come up with any way of really fundamentally addressing it, right? They're just being funded to kind of continue to manage it to some undefined degree of sustainability. And so it strikes me that is also kind of connected to this limited vision, right? Where if a great deal of kind of progressive energies are kind of channeled into this NGO world, it sort of makes sense that what animates it are not broadly ambitious political projects, but instead projects that kind of have to do with like tinkering at the edges and otherwise just kind of managing a situation that's seen as ultimately inalterable and fixed, right? So, which is why it makes sense for this kind of more pessimistic view to take hold in that kind of a space. So, sorry, I've been going on for a bit, but
no. I think it's all really interesting. Neoliberal capitalism is a vicious beast that leaves us with extremely complex problems that one size fits all hashtag like solutions will never be able to answer, and we have to get beyond that level of thinking. And I think the NGO world is just so caught in trying to triage. It's just triage. It's really what it is. And there's going to be more Jordan Neely's in where I'm from in the Bay Area around the same time. I think it was that same week. A young trans man was killed, Banco Brown. So by a security guard who was black, so it didn't get the same type of coverage because the sensationalism around Jordan Neely and the white man doing it, made people want to get out and protest, opposed to another transient young person getting killed by private law enforcement in the name of security for, I think it was a Walgreens in downtown San Francisco. For some reason doesn't get looked at the same way. We can't get the same fervor in the air to want to get out and protest or do anything about that. Because I think ultimately once we get out collectively and yell, then you're done. Right? No more. Okay. Well, we didn't kill him, but there's more people living like Jordan Neely that could use your help. You want to help them out? And it's like, whoa. I yelled over there. Going home now. I got my selfies. I'm done. So that is kind of a sad reality of even George Floyd. Think of all the money that was given out in grants in the name of George Floyd that he never would have qualified for. So, on a somber note.
Yeah. Well, no, and I think just one final thing, what all of this speaks to is, and this is part of what I say about, these various kind of anti-woke books as well, is that, there's really everybody in different ways is just kind of looking at and grasping onto certain symptoms, and what's usually and usually this becomes a distraction in various ways, right? The symptoms become mistaken for causes, right? And so this so then a great deal of attention is devoted to some symptom or other. But meanwhile, and I think again partly because there is a kind of liquidation of kind of broader and more ambitious political projects, it makes sense that this would be the case, that you just have a kind of constant, and in the case of these kind of spectacular, horrible incidents, they tend to be sort of the symptom when it becomes kind of most acute and most disastrous. Only at that point does it attract any attention, right? And of course, by that point, it's already really too late. And so then we, kind of drift along and wait for the next thing to pop up that will present another symptom of these much deeper and kind of festering crises. And unfortunately, what is still lacking is a political project that will attempt to address these on a more fundamental level.
His name is Geoff Shullenberger. He is a managing editor at Compact Magazine. Wherever you are watching or listening to the show, there's a link in the description to his article, The Poverty of Anti-Wokeness. Also, if you're enjoying what you've seen here today, please give the show a like. Definitely subscribe, hit the notification bell so you're alerted whenever we go live. These are all passive gestures that go a very long way in making sure we can continue to do what we do here at TIR. Also, if you have the means and feel so inclined, become a patron for as little as $3 a month or $30 for the year. You can have access to our TIR champagne room, past and present. Join us for movie nights and much, much more. Geoff, thank you so much for hanging out with me. It is the day for me, the afternoon for you. And we are out.